What is up, guys? I just did my first ever live show. 4 hours, count it, 4 hours, mix of all falling music made by me. I'm falling. Alright guys, so I've been making music primarily in my bedroom since I was in high school. I'm no longer in high school. I haven't been for several years now, actually. I've never performed on an instrument in front of an audience before. However, I have in the past played songs that I've written for friends, so I've kind of played my music for an audience before, and usually that's a lot of fun. However, my friend Tylardraws did his very first solo art show. Give it up for him, my man Tylardraws, out here making plays. But that night, he was not that night, several months before, he said, "Hey man, you want a DJ opening night?" And my first thought was, I'm not really a DJ. I make music at home. I've never DJ'd before, but I'll start learning now because I kind of want to. And then he said, "Nah, do you just want to play all your music for 4 hours straight?" And I said, "Oh, fuck yeah. Yeah, I kind of do want to do that, actually." And then I started producing a lot of music very quickly. A lot of it I got to post on Gumroad as copyright-free music. So if you guys need that for your project, link in the description. I originally had intended to make a few tracks for me to play along to on my synth, but then I remembered that playing in front of people is very scary, especially if I mess up. And there was already going to be a live performance that night by another artist named Solomon. He has a new song coming out soon. You should check that out. Link in the description. You're welcome, Solomon. So I didn't end up bringing any synths. However, I brought my bass named Space because my friend Tyler painted Space. So it was like an extra art piece at the art show. And so I have been very excited because some of the things I really wanted to do was play my music for a lot of people. And also I've been really doing a lot of more online projects and getting to edit a lot more of other people's projects. So that's been a lot of fun. But anyway, that's not the point of this. Today we're gonna look at the song I call And 49 that I made as the 49th track for the art show. Alright, so this is office.flp, song name And 49. Basically how I started this song was I started with an initial serum patch, which sounds like this. I used my Moog Matriarch as a MIDI controller, started playing around until I came up with a little groove set on a BPM of 117. The initial sort of pattern I came up with sounds like this. Later on in this project, I started creating the actual sound for it, which is this serum sound that sounds like this. This is kind of a complex sound. We'll get into it a little bit. For oscillator A and B, they were made very similar. I started with a saw wave, and then I duplicated it twice, but I made the second saw wave an analog saw wave, and the middle one I just did some slight adjustments to, and then I morphed and crossfaded between them. It created this evolving saw wave, and then I did something very similar over here, but instead I started with the normal saw wave and then ended with the analog saw wave and then morphed between that. I added 7 voices of unison for both of those, and then I detuned the 2 oscillators from each other plus and minus 3 cents. The sub oscillator was a saw wave. For the noise oscillator, I used a glass lid, but I did not do it as a one shot, so by itself it just continues. It sounds like this. Of course, there's effects and other things on there as well that we'll get into. The filter, I put it on everything and I used a mega low 12. First we'll get into the effects and then we'll get into exactly what the LFO is doing. The envelope is just sort of a basic slow shape that modulates just the volume of the overall sound. For the effects, I use both hyper and dimension. I turn the size all the way up for dimension, and then I put the mix about 16%, a little bit of hyper. For the phaser, I turned the rate all the way down and then did some modulation on the depth, feedback, and mix. For chorus, I set the rate at about 0.08 hertz, and then just some modulation to both the low pass filter and then the mix of it as well. I made the delay time insanely fast, and then did modulation for both the feedback and the mix. When the delay is this quick, it no longer sounds like delay. It's almost like a metallic kind of ringing to the sound. You'll see what it does later on. For the compressor, I use a multi-band compressor. I turned up the gain quite a bit and then turned down the mix. For the reverb, I did a plate, did a lot of modulation to every knob. I wanted the space around it to feel like it was moving, and it just made a really weird quality of the sound. I can't really describe it. You'll see what it does. I play the sound with it. And then without it. It almost sounds like there's wind behind it, but the wind is also carrying the sound itself. It's like the ghost of the sound. I thought it was really cool. I did a EQ with a low cut and a high cut, and then modulation on the high cut. And then for the filter, I did it at a phaser 48, whatever this means. I was just playing around with different ones till I found one I liked, and then I did some modulation on the cutoff, drive, and the whatever this knob does. So let's get into what exactly our modulation is doing. So all the LFOs on this sound are free running. None of them are triggered, so that it's just whenever this note triggers, it'll be at a random point in the modulation. It won't always be exactly the same. This first one is not synced to the song. It's at 2.8 hertz. I have this modulating a few things. If we go back into the oscillator tab, I have it modulating both the position of A and B, as well as the FM from B for our oscillator A, and then the FM from sub for our oscillator B. If we go back into our effects, you can see that this is also controlling the size of the reverb, so that's one of our modulations. Every single one of our parameters for our reverb is modified by something. And then if we go over to LFO2, this one's at 4 bars, and I created an evolving up and down over time that lands at different points. And then if we go back to the oscillator tab, I have that controlling the phase of our glass lid, the blending for the unison on both oscillator A and B. If you notice, I have these pretty much opposite of each other, so that when one oscillator is all the way wide, the other one is very narrow, and vice versa. I also have this modulating the cutoff frequency for our filter, and if we go into our effects, you can see that I have it controlling the pre-delay on the reverb, as well as the mix for the phaser chorus delay. It controls the feedback, how long this metallic ringing is going to ring, essentially, as well as the low pass filter and the depth for our phaser. Most of our motion in our phaser is coming directly from this modulation in LFO2, as the rate is turned all the way off. If we go into LFO3, you can see that I have it controlling just a tiny bit of that phaser feedback, as well as a few parameters on the reverb, the low cut, the high cut, as well as the width. And lastly, I have LFO4, which controls the last little bit of the reverb parameters, as well as the Q, so kind of that resonance knob for low cut, as well as the mix of the filter, the phaser filter. This sound is also, I set it to mono, portamento always, and that has about 54 milliseconds of slide. So when I have it on, it slides between notes. If I turn it off, I just really like the little slides between notes. Alright, moving on. We have more sounds to cover. After I made this, well, alright guys, so here's the true timeline, the true order of events. I came up with part 1, then I came up with part 2, then I came up with part 3. Those were all played and quantized. And then part 4 I pasted by hand because I just wanted to do a weird long bass thing. Made the drums, and then I arranged it and chopped it up the way that you see it. But I'm explaining things a little bit out of order. So today I'm explaining it. Here's each layer. Here's what it sounds like. Here's how he made it, and here's the next one. So I just wanted to specify that when I did this, originally all of them were just the initial saw wave preset, kind of just ringing out loudly and overlapping, and it wasn't very pleasant, but we powered through it. Anyway, here's sound 2. The initial preset for sound 2 sounds like this. No, it kind of actually sounds weird, so let me play it with a part 1 so it makes more sense. So that's what the second part sounded like as I came up with it. When I was finished playing it, I began designing the sound, which this is what it sounds like after I made the sound. How did I make that? I forgot, so we're gonna look at Serum together and rediscover. As you can see, oscillator A is using the digital Mario wavetable, and this one is using the digital distortion 8-bit flop. For the filter, I did a low notch high 24 dB. I put that on everything but the noise oscillator because the noise oscillator is off. The sub oscillator I set to a square wave, and it's just sitting same octave as everything else. A and B I put 3 voices of unison on. Alright, effects section, go. I used 7 voice unison on the hyper. I have the mix at about 22%, detune pretty low, and then the rate really high. I turned the dimension all the way up on this as well, and then had the mix barely on. For the distortion, I turned it all the way up for both the drive and mix as a hard clip. Once again, on the multiband compression, I turned the gain way up and I turned the mix down. Once again, for the EQ, I cut out some of the lows with a low cut and then cut out some of the highs with a high cut. Alright, and then for this sound, I thought really long evolution over time. Slow moving evolution over time. Just a lot of different speeds. Everything pretty much almost, except for oscillator 6 and 7, everything has 2. Every single one of these LFOs are free running, nothing is triggered. They basically divide by 2. So LFO 1 would be a rate of 16 bars. This one would be a rate of 8, 4, 2, 1 bar, a half note, a quarter note, and then that's where I stop. Let's look exactly what each one of these do. For my LFO 1, it controls the oscillator A position as well as the morph of the filter. And so these are two, at least in the filter, the morph does a drastic change in the shape of the sound. I put that on my slowest LFO so that it would gradually change over time. For the LFO 2, I put that on the position of the second oscillator as well as the drive for my filter. LFO 3, we put it on the detune of oscillator B, the filter cutoff. For my LFO 4, which is my 2-bar LFO, I put it on the oscillator A detune, and then I put it on the filter resonance. For my LFO 5, which is 1 bar, I put it on the blend as well as the FM for the sub. My LFO 6 controls the blend, while my LFO 7 controls the pan for both oscillators, and one is a pan at 25, while the other one is negative 25, so that they're panned opposite to each other. That also controls the quantize for my oscillator B. This time I had no effects modulation, so a lot of stuff going on in this one, but it's pretty simple when you break it down. Portamento always is on this one, and then it was set at 40 milliseconds, and the sound was polyphonic. Alright, time for sound 3. when I recorded it, it was like this. Yeah, so very annoying, and I wasn't even sure if that was working properly. Let's hear what it actually sounds like now. With the good sound, it sounds like... That sounds really cool, but how did you make it, you may be asking? Well, good question. So I don't quite remember. We go into here. Originally, this was for both oscillator A and B. I started with just 3 sine waves. What I had done is, if you notice, some of these bins are just kind of randomly up, and as we go along, you'll kind of see it gets progressively just more detailed on a few bins. What I had done was hold up some of the bins in the second wavetable that I had made, and then morphed and then normalized each gain separately to create each individual one. And then I did that as well for this one, however, 8 different sine waves, and then every other one I did that too, and then morphed between those, and that is how I got this shape here. For the sub oscillator, I actually tuned it an octave higher than the rest, and I put it at a straight sub oscillator. I used a mega low 12 for the oscillator A and B. I did a slow attack time, a long decay time, and a long release time on the envelope. I only use LFO 1 and 2 for this sound. For the effects, it was very basic as well. I just used a hard clip distortion with the drive at about 60%, and then another multi-band compressor with the gain up and the mix down, because I am bad at sound design. Alright, for LFO 1, I have it controlling the position for oscillator A and the position for oscillator B. To decide how much for any of these knobs, it's pretty much the same method. You listen to the sound, and based on how it... use your ears, what sounds good, sounds good. The last thing this was modulating was the cutoff for the filter. If we go to LFO 2, you can see it's just modulating the level for both of these, and this is an 8th note triplet that triggers. This sound I did not play, I just pasted in some notes that I thought would sound good. With everything else, the bass line itself sounds like this. You're probably wondering how I made that. Let's get into it. This sound has a macro in its controls. I'll show you what it sounds like with the macros as well once we get to that part. For this sound itself, oscillator A and B are tuned down an octave. They are just a saw wave. There's no unison to it. The sub oscillator is at just the normal 0 octave, I guess. It's a direct output. The filter would be a band pass on both A and B. Oscillator A is getting FM from sub, while oscillator B is getting FM from A. The only LFO I'm using is LFO 1 that is at a triggered half note, and it controls the levels for each oscillator as well as the cutoff, and it is what gives that motion of the sound. For the effects, I used hyperdimension again, where I turned up the size all the way and then had this very low, 7-voice unison with the rate very high, mixed down to about 20%. I did a hard clip distortion all the way up. Once again, one of those fast feedback kind of delays where it gave it a metallic sound as well as a multi-band compressor. What the macro though is controlling is where most of the sound changes. It controls the FM levels for both of these. It also controls the resonance, pushing it downwards, as well as taking the drive down and just the overall mix of the filter down. It controls the feedback level for the delay, making it more metallic and on the macro, I changed the curve so that it barely changes at first, but then as you start getting really high, it's a very quick dramatic change. I will show you the macro along with everything else as soon as I show you the drums, which is just a very basic drums. I have a kick, snare, this hi-hat, this rim shot, a triangle, and a wood block. It's a very basic drum pattern. I only use the same drum pattern through the whole song. I just kind of chopped it up when it started and stuff like that. Did I mention I did this the morning before I had to go check out the art studio, and I did not have a lot of time, so I forgot to add that into the lore. This was done with time constraint, arbitrary time constraint. Anyway, the drums sound like this. Now we're going to circle back around and we are going to show off what that bass line sounds like with the modulation. Once I got to this point, I realized I probably want to make a new project because I really like how this sounds, so I want to make a video out of it. Let's go. Specifically, I made this new project because I like using macros. I like having some sort of wonky change in the sound that I do by hand, and I kind of get to sit there as long as I want and just create the perfect performance, essentially. For lack of better words, I kind of get to craft what I feel would be the best take, and that's really cool to me. So I created some macros for each sound after I rendered out that bass line. As you can see, I still have everything just chopped up where it was, but these were the macros I added. So we'll get into each sound, I'll explain what it does, and then we'll hear it in use. Alright guys, how do you want me to explain this? Would you like to hear it first? Okay guys, we're just going to play the sound first, and then, no, I'll explain the macro because that makes more sense. Okay, I'm going to explain this to you guys. You guys are gonna listen, take notes, write down what the macros are, and then listen to the sound, and you can tell me what you think. Alright, so we have macro 1, so it controls 5 things for our first sound. Things that I decided I wanted to control with the macro specifically was the level of this glass lid. I showed you guys kind of how strange the sound can be. I just wanted some level control so I could turn that up randomly, as well as I used it to control the mix of the delay so that I can make this effect a little bit louder randomly, as well as a lot of phaser filter modulation, specifically on the cutoff, drive, and whatever the fuck this is, but it sounds good when I move it. With all of those added, you begin to get a sound like this. And then if I turn that off, it's not too drastic of a change, actually, now that I think about it, but it's the finer details that really matter. For sound 2, I did some more macros. So I went into my macro here, and then I went into my effects section, and I was like, I'm just going to absolutely fuck this sound. All of my reverb modulations were done by this. Now the windy quality is even wilder because various aspects of this were already controlled by the LFO, so randomly as the wind is kind of slowly going by, in my mind it's like I'm the sorcerer and I'm grabbing the wind and I'm like, alright, it's time to go even faster, but in this direction. Or it's time to slow it down a little bit, but then when I get bored I let go of the wind and the wind just keeps doing its thing. Yeah, I also had it control the damp of this combs filter as well as the mix of it, because the combs filter can make it kind of sound out of tune almost, and so I thought the mix knob would be nice to help get rid of that as a dampener. Without the modulation, it sounds like this. I guess that's not without the modulation. All those other effects are now active. It's just frozen in one position, so there's no motion. But when I add motion, it sounds like this. That's kind of what I really like, because when it's up here, there's a lot of space to it, and then all of a sudden that space kind of drops out and then really builds back up. Finally, we have our last serum sound, where I did some modulation too. This macro is set at 0, so it should be all of those sounds off. If we look at this one as well, we're gonna go into the effects. I did a lot of stuff to the detune and the mix on the hyper dimension. I added a little bit of dimension in with this, as well as I cut back the mix on the chorus. I turned up the low pass, a ton of modulation on the chorus, and because of all this modulation, I ended up turning off the distortion. It was a little much, and then I did some modulation on the filters, which is an all passes filter. Without the macro running, it sounds like this. When you add that modulation in, it sounds like this. We'll cut back where there's more modulation. And then without that modulation. It makes it really out of tune, but I think it sounds really cool with the drums and stuff. This is what the track sounds like so far. Most of modulation on the third pattern takes place whenever the bass cuts out, like at this part. So yeah, I leave the modulation alone for the most part whenever the bass is on, just because it gets out of tune, and with the bass it is very grating. But without the bass, it sounds kind of cool, so I did it whenever the bass was not playing. At this point, I felt like this track was ready to be mixed, but I did not spend very much time on it, and I felt bad, because I made arbitrary rules for myself. I beat those arbitrary rules by a lot. I was thinking, wall of sound, ambience, let's go, office time. I thought it would be cool to be like my job. I made it sound like an office, but then I thought it would be funny, because sometimes I've never played, actually I take that back, I have played Among Us twice in my life. And when it was really funny, I thought it was the stupidest shit, but now that it's getting old, all of a sudden my brain is like, alright guys, Among Us, am I right? So I thought venting, so then I started wondering what the inside of vents would sound like. I decided the office ambience would switch to me venting, so to speak. I went to freesound.org, I think .org, link in description for all the sounds I used. I used all Creative Commons 0 sounds. I love going on there and just typing random words. I made this project. For this project, I had various sounds that I was using, and I did different things at different times. I had a desk fan sound that I just chopped up random bits from and then pasted them around, as well as I took random office chatter that I found as well as typing, and I just kind of shifted between them so that random like typing clicks would be caught between the chops, so it would sound like the Office was glitching out, so to speak. As well as on the desk fan and Office, I set the levels for them, and then I routed them together with a bunch of effects. Specifically, I EQ'd out all the low end. I added a crystallizer that's detuned down. Basically, I just really like echoing effects in my ambience. I kind of like the idea that you're like zoning out and everything's kind of just like repeating, and you're getting kind of entranced in whatever's going on. I added some saturation to the sound as well, just some high-end saturation. Then I just fucking love randomly throwing micro shift 3 of them on and just playing with the settings, and then using a different style for each one when it's a sound that doesn't matter. Because guys, I have a problem. I really like to use effects, so when I have a sound that I know doesn't matter, I will just throw effects at it until I run out of processing power in my computer. But this is what the Office ambience sounds like. For the vents, what I was thinking is I needed a metal scrape. That would be like my slow moving fan that's in the vent somewhere, as well as like air escaping, and then just sort of vent ambience, I guess. Well, I found this industrial vent and I started chopping it up because it made a great like transition in. I'll get to this part in a second. But for the metal scrape, I stretched it out a ton, so it's a very like slow, evil kind of sounding metal scrape. On the air escaping, I did EQ to try to get rid of a lot of different frequencies, as well as pan man to kind of make it feel like it's moving around you. I routed that all to this, where I threw another crystallizer on there because, like I said, just slow effects. Then I cut out some more low end. This sound sounds like this though. Very spooky. And then I took the air escaping in the vent and I kind of used it as a riser. This is me climbing into the vents because I'm venting. After I made those, I rendered them out like this, as this one. Then I did this one, and then I did this one. Then once I made all of those, I threw them all in the final project. Well, that's one for the kill count. Fuck. For this, I EQ'd everything. I added a limiter for either the kick or the snare because I wanted a lot of sidechain in this. I then created a reverb small, reverb, and reverb large. Basically just 3 different decay times of reverb that I could send different things to, as well as a bus for that. I made this, which is just a reverb into a crystallizer I called unsure, which melody 1 goes into the unsure. But then those go into a reverb bus. I then routed all of my ambience to this track here, which just did a limiter for both the kick and the snare at various amounts. So like this one right here would be for my kick, and the threshold is all the way down here with a ratio right here. My snare is a little bit higher than that. My ratio though is a lot lower. I did some drive and reverb to my drums. The drive is pretty much insane. I did a drum sizzle preset, then I did a randomized D-Blue crusher, and then I turned the mix up and the smoothing down, as well as fucked around with the EQ till I got something I liked. Then I ran it through Decapitator, turned the tone down to a little bit dark, punish on, another D-Blue crusher and a double lock, and I guess to play you what this sounds like. But yeah, so pretty much that's all of it. When I added the ambience, so I added the Office ambience, I cut it there. I use a transition for right when the drums kick out to bring us in the vents, and then when the drums come out again, I reverse the transition so we're coming back out of the vents, and it just kind of does that. I guess what I'm trying to say is, really with this whole video, what I've been trying to portray is just my appreciation for the time that I can appreciate you taking to watch this. So thank you guys for tuning in for another SiSySho. SiSySho. Shout out Tylardraws.